elbow?
Well, from what I know about the elbow, um, usually when African Americans move to this area, the majority of them settle in the elbow. And it was called the elbow when I moved there. I moved there when I was around 4 in 1960. Um, Before my time, it was called Little Africa, which I learned about later in life. But all during my time in the elbow, it was called the elbow. And that was the significance of it for me. And when I lived there, it was all populated by African Americans. Of course, this is like back in the 60s. And at that time, Guthrie was pretty much still segregated. Jim Crow laws were prevalent in the area. And what that was there was supposedly separate but equal laws for the African American. The majority of Guthrie was comprised of, I'd say, a lot of religious groups. We had Mormons, we had Hittites, but for the most part, Catholics. There were a lot of Catholics around Guthrie at the time that I came here, and I went to Catholic school, I guess, for first 3 years of my education, which would have been kindergarten, first and second. I attended Catholic schools. The hospital was Catholic. We had a Catholic convent on the west side of town. It later on, it was purchased by the government and became Job Corps Center. And still today, there's a grave site out there at the Job Corps, and it consists of priests and nuns. Those are the primary residents in that cemetery. The hospital was run by Catholics at that time, as well as a large number of churches around Guthrie. So I grew up as a kid. I would go to Mass through the week, and on the weekends I went to church because I was a Baptist.
So when you think about the words, the elbow, what images come to mind immediately?
Well, immediately I think of the residents in the elbow, the people. We were a community. We were close-knit. It was just like some of our contemporaries talk about, we played outside. We didn't spend time in the house. If we got a chance to get out, we were out. Most of the kids in my neighborhood, we played stickball. We wasn't playing stickball or something like that. We would fish. We would hunt. Those were the things that kids did back when I was young. Ride our bicycles. And when you talk about community in the elbow, I could be away from home, but there's a code of behavior. When you're away from home, you act like you had sense, because the people around the corner could chastise you as well as you would get chastised at home. Or, I don't know how they did it. There wasn't a whole lot of phones in the neighborhood, but if you did something wrong, usually that news made it home before you did. And when you got home, you were in trouble. When we were young kids, when the street lights came on, we were supposed to be at home. That was our cue to go home. I say that it was a sense of community. Like most of us kids, for the older people in the neighborhood who couldn't travel, they would enlist us kids to go run errands to the store or do certain chores for them. And at that time, it wasn't so much about the money, because there were several times where we would like mow a lawn for like $2. And it might be the size of half a football field. It was still $2. It was a matter of principle of helping your neighbors out. And I can recall we had neighbors across the street from us. And there was a young lady that lived there. Her name was Patsy Ruth. And Patsy Ruth, at the time that I was a child growing up in the elbow, she was in her 30s. And she was an autistic individual. She would come outside, and my folks would encourage me and my siblings to always include Patsy Ruth in all of our activities. So if we were out, we were playing something she could take part in, like a hide and seek game or something like that, we always included her. And I can recall she was always happy when she was with us. She was always smiling. She was made a part of everything. And it never dawned on me until I was an adult that Patsy was an adult then. She seemed just like a child, just like the rest of us. And we included her in things that we did. And when her relatives came to town, they would invite us across the street to visit with their relatives and get to know them. It was just a sense of community. One of the things that I always remember, and I used to tell people, is the lady around the corner from me, her name was Mrs. Gilbert. Mrs. Gilbert was an avid smoker, and she liked her beer. And she would send us kids to the store, which was what we considered outside the elbow, on the ridge of the elbow. And when we would go out on the ridge, we would be on what we call the west side of town, and there was a little store called Cotton's. And Mrs. Gilbert would send us to Cotton's store. Cotton's sold cigarettes, beer, groceries. They had a deli. They had everything, and it came from it was more of a home setting. They lived in part of it, and the front part of the house was a business, and there were several places like that throughout Guthrie. That was a way for people to earn extra revenue, was to have a sideline, something that they sold or something that they did from the home. Anyway, Miss Gilbert would send us to the store, and at that time we could buy 6-pack of beer, we could buy cigarettes. Some of the residents, they chewed snuff, or they chewed block tobacco. We would be their gophers. And all they would do was give us a note, they'd give us some money, we'd run to the store for them, and then in return, we might get like a quarter or 50 cents for doing the legwork. Of course, everything was really inexpensive at that time. It's only 25 cents to go to the movies, or 25 cents to get in the swimming pool. So most of us kids, we were ready and willing. If they had an errand to run, we'd be more than happy to ride our bicycle over or walk in the group. One of the other things that we did as kids, we collected pop bottles. Pop bottles was a big thing back in the day, and if you could collect enough pop bottles, you could earn pretty good sum of money. So lots of us kids, we would collect pop bottles, turn them in for the deposit, which in turn allowed us to attend movies, buy snacks, and like I said, one of our biggest things in the summertime was to go swim in the local pool. Of course, a lot of us kids, before the pool opened, we would swim in the cottonwood there, which surrounded the elbow. And that's one of the particular things about the elbow that's most noticeable. There were 3 ways to get in, and there were all 3 bridges. There was a bridge at the east and the west end of Perkins Avenue, and on 9th Street. Those are the main intersections in the elbow. And on 9th Street, there was a bridge on the the north end. And those were the only entryways to get into the elbow, because it was completely surrounded by water. And that's one of the things that made it unique. Like I said, we had a colorful list of individuals that lived there. Anything that you might want to do or see was usually available in the elbow. And I say that means like talent. We had talented individuals. We had people that could sing, people that could dance. There was always somebody in the elbow who was super talented. We had a little club right outside, well, right on the edge of the elbow when you'd cross the bridge on the Perkins East entrance. There was a little club there, and it was called the Boondocks. And the Boondocks was run by a family that lived there in the elbow, and that was their sideline job. That was the way they made their extra money. I can't remember what the husband did as a living. I can't remember his occupation. But most of the ladies that lived in the elbow, the majority of them were at home while the husband was away at work. Not so with my aunt and the lady that raised me, because she was gone every day. She was working. My uncle, he worked every day. we made a pretty good life for us. Now, by today's standards, when we came up, I was probably considered poor, but I never knew that because we had such a rich life. I've never been without a place to sleep. I've never been without food. And most importantly, I've never felt unloved. That was the biggest thing about the elbow.
Absolutely.
I could be around the corner, and if I couldn't get home in time, and they had a telephone, they'd ring up and call around. Well, it's late. Yuggie's going to spend the night here tonight. He'll be home in the morning. And that's the way they would take care of one another in the elbow. You know, they wouldn't let us get out there and get in any trouble or be in any danger. The whole neighborhood would look out for one another. And that's one of the most cohesive things that I can remember about the elbow. We respected anybody that was older than us. When we came into a house or whatever, we were expected to speak, hello, good morning, good evening. We were expected to say something, not just come in and say nothing. And it was always, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. We were very respectful. And I can remember lots of times when I thought about what I was going to do once I grew up. And of course, you know, all the kids are in a hurry to hurry up and grow up because it opens up a whole new world of things you can and can't do. And one of those things for me, I wanted to be like, say, the men in my neighborhood or even my own dad. At that time, there was men wore suits, ties, dress shoes, hats. They were clean, went to the barber shop. They were well shaven. And that's the kind of thing that I wanted to do once I grew up. And as soon as I did, I emulated what I saw in my neighborhood. And lots of times, I'm going to borrow the words of one of my contemporaries, Reverend Turner. And Reverend Turner said, you know, he said this of the elbow, because most of the people in the elbow, they might not get things that were brand new. They might get them from a thrift store or secondhand or donated. But they were some of the cleanest, best dressed people you ever want to see.
Absolutely.
And they were proud of who they were. And when you left, they were proud of how you represented the people in the neighborhood. And I can recall always being told, don't you go out there in the streets and act a fool. This is where they put it.
Absolutely.
You know, you don't forget where you came from. And I came from the elbow. We had a certain mannerism, certain behavior. And there was just things that my aunt taught us. There was these things that you don't do because they reflect on the family and they reflect on your community as a whole. And one of her pet peeves, you don't ever take anything that's not yours. To this day, you can't make me take anything that's not mine. I will not steal. I can't steal. It's not in me. And I try and treat people the way I want to be treated. That was one of the other big things. And one of the things my mom used to always say is never, ever hate. Don't ever hate. You know, if you hate, well, she says if you hate, you'll never get into the kingdom of heaven.
That's right.
You got to be able to love to get in. If you can't love and all that's in your heart's hate, you'll never make it. And that's one of the lessons that resonates in the elbow.
She always used to tell me, it weighs you down.
Yeah.
It weighs you down too much. Let it free. Let it go. Absolutely.
And like I said, they were extremely diverse people in the elbow. And like I said, a lot of the people in the elbow, I never really saw them 100% when I was growing up. But as I grew older, I learned to understand and recognize, you know, how I grew up, what I was seeing, and how I saw it. We had, like I say, we had a diverse group that lived in the elbow. There was a lady there that lived in the elbow, and you know, it never dawned on me that she could be a little bit different, but she never wore dresses. She always wore jeans or overalls, big floppy hat, and she was never married. And I always wondered, after I got old, I always thought about her, and then I come to the final realization that, well, she wasn't supposed to be married, and she was who she was, and, well, you kind of get my meaning.
Absolutely.
But we had people from the what's known as the LGBTQ community. We had them back then, but they were just as respected as anybody else at any other time. And like I say, when I was a kid growing up, I didn't really notice these things. I come to the realization after I was an adult. But they were some of the most genuine and loving people that I've ever had the opportunity to know. And this lady, Mrs. Brown, she would buy fish as we would fish, and we would bring our catch on the way home. She'd see us and she'd flag us down, and if we had catfish, she wanted to buy those. And then we'd sell them to her at a quarter a piece, big old catfish. But she was one of the people that I truly remember in the elbow, because if we ever had questions, she was always honest, and she was always willing to tell us what she knew about anything that we asked. And we always ask about things in the elbow. And one of the things that we asked her one time was, and as kids, we hear different stories. And they told us that as you cross the tracks coming into the elbow, if you would go up there at midnight on a Saturday night, you'd see some man bouncing his head on the tracks because he had died on the tracks and it cut off his head. And of course, we thought they're just telling us those stories because they want to scare us kids and keep us off the tracks. Well, maybe they did. But at that bucket I talked about, that boondocks, there were things that went on there. There was like gambling and drinking and, who knows what else. But with the gambling, Mrs. Brown shared this with us kids. She said, well, I don't know about anybody on the tracks or any of that, but she says, I do know that there's a lot of souls that are unresting in this elbow because there are people who have met their fate. What would happen is they would gamble, they would become inebriated, and as she put it, somebody would clip them, which meant rob them, hit them in the head, rob them. Some of them, she said, went into the Cottonwood River. Some of them were found the next day. But she said there's a lot of unrested souls in the elbow. And so she said I couldn't confirm nor deny what people say they saw on the tracks. She said, I'm just going to share that with you. And she was very candid. She was very candid about it. And as far as my experiences with seeing things in the elbow, me personally, I've heard and felt and seen things in the elbow that I cannot explain. I won't elaborate on the things that I've seen today, but I will tell you that I believe they were real. I'll tell the story the same way each time I tell it. I'll swear on a stack of Bibles that it's all true. And those words that Lena Brown gave us, that there are unresting souls in the elbow, I firmly believe that. And I firmly believe I have experienced and seen those things.
Now, I will stop you right there for just a quick second. Lena Brown, I'm wondering, because we actually went out to a martial arts seminar one time, and we camped out. And I remember there being a house next to that campsite. Was that the home of... That was the
Galbraith home that we camped by. Home. Yes.
Okay.
That was the Galbraith home.
That was the Galbraith home.
Yeah.
I was curious.
Yeah.
I know I've seen some of my own things. There's been some strange things that I've heard and seen throughout there. But we'll go ahead and stay on track. That's for another story. I'm highly interested in that kind of stuff for sure.
Yeah.
This is where it all started for me, everybody. Like these kind of stories right here. But so like as far as businesses, well, they probably wouldn't be called businesses today. I understand that things were a lot differently back then. But what are some of the earliest businesses, establishments that you can remember in the elbow, like churches or stores? Or I've heard you mention the Boondocks, but I've also heard about another place called the Blue Hole. Those one and the same thing. So what establishments or businesses were in the elbow that you can remember?
Well, as a really, really young man, there was a spot in the elbow, and it was simply called Jim Hunden's. And I believe that to be the name of the man that owned the facility. And what it was just a house with a porch that's maybe 5 or 6 feet from the ground. You'd go up steps to get into Mr. Herndon's establishment. And I believe it was built like that because the elbow would routinely flood every year. And I believe he went to higher ground. But when you go into Mr. Herndon's establishment, for us kids, there'd be like a counter with snacks and candy, cupcakes, things like that. And he had an old pop machine. You put your nickel in, open the door, and twist the handle and pull your bottle out. You could only get those at Mr. Herndon's. He had the only pop machine at the time I was growing up in the elbow. Of course, needless to say, in Mr. Herndon's establishment, I don't know what else he sold other than that, but there was always dominoes being played, and I know that there was always dice games there. So I imagine that's why he was there. Then there was another gentleman I used to work for. His name was Andrew Allen. At the time that I knew him, we called him Andy Gump. That's the name that his contemporaries gave him. And from what I understood, Andy Gump was a character from the newspaper, and that's what they called Mr. Allen. Mr. Allen owned a candy store in the elbow. That's all he sold was candy and snacks for the kids. There'd be balloons, toys, paper airplanes, all kind of stuff like that. That's what he did in the evening. Whatever he did in the daytime, I believe he worked construction. And when he would get off early, he would open up his candy store. He was a veteran. Mr. Gump served our country. He was in the Army. He was a man of many talents. And as I grew up, he would enlist all the kids in the neighborhood to do our jobs. They may be tearing down a building. It may be putting up a building. As I said, Mr. Allen was very, very smart. He bought property there in the elbow and enlisted the help of us kids in tearing down the houses in the surrounding area and built him a 2-story home there in the elbow. It was constructed of what you call reclaimed lumber. Even the nails were reclaimed. And we stood out sat out in his yard before the house was erected, and we straightened nails according to size, and we'd place them in cans. He drove those same nails back in to build his home. He married, we had a real tall lady. Her name was Lily. I'm trying to remember Lily's last name. I'm kind of thinking she had the same name as Reverend Allen. Well, I say Reverend Allen because later on in his endeavors in the elbow, he became an ordained minister. And he was quite good to us. And at that time, he was still enlist the help of us kids. And after we'd help him build his home by now. And like I said, he built everything. We helped him pour the driveway. After his home was built and then he was married, he would invite us over to work for him, at which time he'd continue to pay us. And then his wife would cook some of the most fabulous large meals. And gosh, he'd invite all us kids in. We'd sit down at a table that he'd built. Like I say, Mr. Allen was very, very, I don't have words to describe the talent that man had. If you name it, he could do it. He could weld. He was a carpenter. He was an electrician. He was a plumber. Just everything. Let me see, another business that was there. There was a lot of agriculture in the elbow. Those who were fortunate enough to have cows had cows. We personally at home, we had pigs and chickens. That was what we could afford. Let's see, and then we had a man, his name was Mr. Lights. He was a gardener. He lived in the elbow and he worked primarily in Oklahoma City and Edmond. He drove an old Dodge pickup, and from what I understand, he never got out of second gear from Guthrie to Oklahoma City. He'd do maybe 25 miles an hour all the way down the highway, whether it was 77 or the newly built I-35. He would rarely get over 15 or 20 miles an hour from Guthrie to Edmond and back. I had the pleasure of knowing a gentleman that drove his truck other than himself. His name was Merlin King. They called him Screwball. He was a resident there in Guthrie. Screwball drove his truck, and he says, and I happened to be out when they were talking about it. He says, yeah, that truck will do over 15 or 20. He said that I had it up to 70 miles an hour. He said that truck was about to fall to pieces. It had never been that fast. Yeah, yeah, everybody called him Screwball, but his name was Merlin King.
And this is the same Screwball that I grew up with too, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's correct.
Okay, so
correct.
So he knew a little bit about the elbow as well when he was alive.
Yes, he did.
Did he?
And of course, down the street from us was a family called the Glovers. It was comprised of Orville Glover, Leona Glover, former Leona Cherry, her son and daughter, Elmer and Donna Kay. Well, I mentioned that family because Orville was sort of like my mentor. Orville taught me how to roof. Orville taught me how to do a little carpentry work. In other words, I was his apprentice. He would hire me to help him do jobs. And Orville was a jack of all trades. Orville could roof, he could paint, he did carpentry work, and when he wasn't doing that, he played in the '89 baseball league. He was a heck of an athlete, and I'll always remember Orville Glover as a baseball player. And he was good at that, but he was even better because at the time they had a thing called donkey baseball in Guthrie, where all the players rode donkeys while they played baseball.
Really?
Not only could Orville Glover play avid baseball, he could do it while riding on a donkey.
Have y'all ever heard of donkey baseball? Like, really?
Yeah.
That's crazier than cornhole.
Yeah. Took place right here in Guthrie.
Wow.
You'd go to the game, the people outfield would be sitting on a donkey, the guy at bet would be betting from a donkey. He'd hit the ball and you'd see donkey and center fielder go over, and they were that avid that they would ride with no hands and play baseball.
Oh my goodness.
And when they would arrive in Guthrie, you always knew it because they would be parked on Springer Avenue, which is where our baseball diamond starts. And they would be parked there, and you'd see a bus that the players came out on, and then you'd see a bus behind it that housed the donkeys. And it was donkey baseball in Guthrie. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah, it was something to see. We went to several games. My uncle Elijah would take Welton and myself to several baseball games, so we grew up loving the sport. We grew up loving to go to the baseball diamond because my uncle, he'd be sitting watching the game. Welton and I would be under the bleachers looking for change that people had lost from their pockets. So yeah, we enjoyed getting out and about. But yeah, Orville Glover, I'll always remember him as an avid athlete. Not a very big guy. Thin, wiry, but very, very able.
I heard there were a lot of people that could have been some great athletes in the elbow. I heard there were some people that could have went to some different types of leagues and things like that.
Well, we had people that did quite well. You know, around the corner from us, my best friend lived around the corner. Now, his name was Leander. Leander's uncles, they all either served in the Army. Well, they were our. I don't know what label to give them, but I'll tell you a little bit about each of Leander's uncles. There was his uncle Buddy. Buddy would be when he left Langston University. And we would watch him and his friend work out in the backyard. Buddy was our Hercules because they would put all the weights that they owned on the end of that bar. And as they would lift it up, you could hear them clanking and you would see the bar swaying. And you'd see them standing there, muscles rippling. I mean, just, they were awesome. Buddy played for the Miami Dolphins. He played professional football.
Do you know what year that was?
I'm not sure. But when they would come up to visit, I always thought of him as Hercules because he had the curly hair and the big rippling muscles. And then, of course, there was Lee's uncle Marcus. And they all had these names of like Greek god. His name was Marcus Aurelius Wade. That was his God-given name. And they had these names that even their names were prestigious. Not to talk about the deeds that they do, but Marcus was the man that came up, and he would get Leander and myself every summer and take us to Oklahoma City and teach us about being men and make us paint and make us work, and he would take care of us. He would, while we were in his care, he would feed us and make sure get in there and bathe. He taught you hygiene, everything. Taught you how to deal with people. He took us on fishing trips, and it would be quite funny because he'd take us anywhere that we wanted to go. He would take us. But if we were out fishing and he got his line caught up and he said, "Hey, go out there. I don't want to lose my lure. You swim out there and get that." Well, that's what we were for. Yeah, we'd swim out and get it. But I tell you what, he wouldn't let anything happen to us, because when the snakes would come out toward us when we were out swimming getting his lures, he had his .22 rifle there and he'd go, he'd sink them.
It's funny that you mentioned Leander's name, because I interviewed Tawny last weekend, and he was telling me a funny story about yourself. Since we're talking about athletes and stuff, I got to give props to my dad, because I heard a pretty athletic story about him too, and I just want to clarify that if you remember this or not. But Tawny tells me one time, I guess it was you, him, Leander, and Ralph, and I guess y'all were out hunting, and he said that y'all were in some trees, and y'all had your rifles down, y'all were hunting for squirrels, I guess.
Yeah.
He said where y'all were hunting at, there was another neighborhood across from y'all, and the police ended up coming.
I remember that.
So Tony said that everybody took off running, and he said this is crazy, because he said everybody that went into the river, they went into the river. He said your daddy ran across the river.
Tell us that story, Mack.
It was on a limb.
It was on a limb.
It was on a limb. It was a fallen tree across the river. And that's what I went across on. Yeah. Yeah. I do remember that story. I remember it well. You got to remember, this is a time when it was not uncommon for us to walk down Oklahoma Avenue with our rifles. As long as they weren't loaded, we could carry our rifles, because people routinely went hunting and fishing, things like that. Mm-hmm. Anyway, that particular day, we couldn't find anything to hunt, so we went down by Noble Park there in the Elbow. Across from Noble Park is a big field with a walnut tree. Mm-hmm. So we figured it'd be a good idea to go down there and check that tree. And once we got down there were no squirrels, but we could see them on the riverbank. Mm-hmm. So we went right over to the cottonwood. And I believe it's 12th Street runs around behind it. Well, we would see squirrels, and we would shoot up at the squirrels. But on the other side of the river, we were raining buckshots down on people's homes. And they called the police. Tawny was our, I guess you'd call him our game packer. Mm-hmm. He didn't have a firearm, anything like that. But if we would shoot a squirrel or whatever, he had these sacks, these plastic sacks, and he would go get our kill, put it in a bag, and he would carry our game for us. Well, this went on for about, maybe 10, maybe 15 minutes. We'd see a squirrel, boom, we'd shoot it. He'd go over and he'd pick it up. In the meanwhile, buckshots are raining down on those people's houses. Well, we shot one, and it hit the river. Ralph went out to retrieve it. There was a big log sticking out in the water, so he shimmied out that log, and he was waiting on that squirrel to float down. He was going to retrieve it. And about that time, we heard the police on the loudspeaker, and their words were, "All right, you guys, stop that fire and come on out." Little did they know they were on this side, and we were on the opposite side. So we stopped firing, and we came out, and we were running. We were trying to get away. It's quite a funny story, because as we got out of the riverbank, we ran towards 9th Street Bridge. We crossed the street, went down behind the park, and that's where I shimmied across this log and went across the creek. Well, everybody didn't get down there to cross in the same place. So some people had to jump in the creek and swim to the other side. That's why they thought I ran across the water. We didn't all, we didn't all go out at the same time.
Well,
And we didn't all get away the same way. Well, we get across to that side and then we have to cross again. But it's behind Leander's house and the water's no deeper than maybe halfway up to your knee. Anyway, Ralph was out on the limb and he wasn't successful in getting away from the police. So by the time he got to 9th Street, the police were already crossing the bridge. Well, he was smart enough to know how to break down his shotgun. So he undid the clip, broke it down, took off the barrel, and he shoved it down his pant leg. And then he took the stock part and he stuck it up under his shirt and tucked it into his belt. And he was walking down the street. And they asked him, "Have you seen any boys down there shooting?" "No, sir." And he limped on down the street and they drove on off, never realizing they were talking to the very person who was doing some of the shooting. Yeah. Yeah, and we all got together on Leander's front porch, and incidentally, Ralph was dry and I was dry. Everybody else was soaking wet. Yeah.
yeah, he still today believes you ran across the water that day.
No.
So why do you think it is that people start? What was the cause of the community? Just when everybody started leaving, what was the cause of that?
Well, I think one of the big causes was the fact that some people were just tired because we had another establishment there that I can remember, Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church, which was my church in the Elbow, and I can remember every year when it would flood, we'd all come out, we'd hook up the water hoses. The basement was always thick with this silt. It wasn't really like mud. It was thin, real fine, real dark. And I call it silt because it was very hard to get it off the floor. But we would wash it out, sweep it down with brooms, wash out, because the whole basement, it was mostly constructed of concrete because of the repeated floods. And when you would go into the basement, each side of the church to get into the basement had a retaining wall built in front of the door. There was a retaining wall. There would be steps to go up over the wall and then down the other side and in through the door. There was one on both ends. And in the basement of the kitchen, the basement of the church, that's where our kitchen was, and some smaller classrooms. That Elbow, it flooded so much, I think that the residents were just a little bit leery about staying there and cleaning up every single year, every year. And as a kid, I can recall coming out several times in the middle of the night or early in the morning. Guthrie Fire Department's there with boats to get us out because there was no other way to get in or out of the Elbow other than by boat. And as they would get us out, they would take us over, and usually we would have a place set up on 2nd Street. Today, I think there's the old vet building is still there. There's that large brick structure that stands on the west side of the road that used to be a church. And that's where most of us would be housed. I can recall the Red Cross would always be there. They'd always be available. And we met them at that church. And for the time that we spent outside the Elbow, we usually slept on a cot. And our meals came from the Red Cross truck, which consisted of sandwiches, cartons of milk. And that's what we would eat during the flood. And we may do that for 2 or 3 days till the water receded. I think that's one of the main things that caused people to leave. Is because they just got tired of every year, same thing. And of course, as a kid, I heard a lot of rumors, that there's oil in the Elbow and they're just trying to run us out, so they make sure it floods every year. Don't know how true that is, but after several families were moved away from the Elbow, haven't seen a flood in a while. And when we did, it was a situation where just like here recently, we had so much rain. When you get enormous amounts of rain, there's no way to stop it from flooding. That's the only time I think Guthrie floods now.
So to my knowledge is, I guess the government offered monies for people to be able to leave the Elbow. Do you think everybody would?
Well, I don't know who really Who offers the money? I don't know if it was the government. I don't know if it was local government, but I noticed they were trying to relocate people to get them out of the flood zone. And like I said, there were some diehard people that said, I'm not leaving, but me and my family, we were ready to go. We had enough of that.
Had enough of the flood.
We were ready to go.
Absolutely.
And if we can get another location and get out of that flood district, more than happy to. And the people that I know of that left, they moved to some of the highest points in Guthrie that there are. My aunt moved right behind the temple here. And the temple, as you know, is one of the highest elevations in Guthrie.
Absolutely.
It can be seen from a number of miles off. And one of her good friends, the lady that lived around the corner, Mrs. Berry, she got a house a couple of blocks from my aunt. And she's over on Noble is where she got out. And like I said, most people that moved out, they moved to some of the highest elevations they could possibly find because they were tired of that.
We talked about a lot of names, and I know a lot of people have passed now, and it's hard to capture all the history or just a tip of the iceberg of the history of the Elbow. What are some names that come to mind of the people that you knew in the Elbow, just for historical purposes?
Well, I knew of a man named Warren Singer Sr. He had a son and a daughter, and I visited their home on occasions and hung out with his kids, played with his kids. Warren Singer owned a business in Guthrie. He owned an establishment up on 2nd Street. And you see, who else comes to mind? Well, I mentioned Reverend Allen. Reverend Allen he was known and loved by all the kids in the Elbow because he interacted with so many of us. I'm trying to think of mostly the adults. Now, that's a man Clifford Galbraith. That's our first cousin's dad. Clifford Galbraith knew my grandfather. And my mother used to tell me that those were two of the best shots that she'd ever seen. And she swears by this. She said, you can find people that can shoot the head off a match. She said Clifford Galbraith and Isaac Keener Sr. could light a match with a rifle. Not shoot the head off, but light a match. And she was very, very explicit when she tried to tell me that there's a difference in shooting the head off a match and lighting a match. It takes a lot of skill to light one. She said both of those individuals could do that. And I have no reason to doubt her because as a kid I saw Mr. Galbraith several times. He would reach into his overalls and take out this German Luger. And I knew that's what it was because it's got the little box on the bottom. But he would take out that Luger and we would hear cicada. We call them locusts. But he'd hear a cicada in his elm tree in his front yard, and he says, you see him? And we'd listen. Yeah, we see him. There he is on that limb right there. And he'd take his pistol, raise his arm up, one shot. He says, you see him now? But that man could, and he claimed that he couldn't see. But he's one of the best shots that I've ever witnessed. Yeah, the guy that couldn't see. He's quite a fella.
That's
Quite a
cool.
fella.
So what would you like to see happen to the Elbow?
Well, it'd be nice if all the streets were reopened. Some of the structures replaced because they used to have some really nice homes in the Elbow. I can remember on the street I lived on, Grant Street, there were a number of two-story structures, and those homes were pretty nice and pretty large. They were all fenced-in yards, quite large. I remember this one lady, her name was we called her Mrs. Sarah Thomas, which was a common thing in the Elbow. It was always Mr. or Mrs., and then they usually said their first name. If they gave the middle name, sometimes they'd give it and the last name. Well, this lady's name was Mrs. Sarah Thomas, and she lived in a two-story structure down the street from us. And inside her fence, once you would go in her gate, she had to own almost like half a block. And I know it well because I used to mow it for like $4. That was big money when I mowed her yard. And anyway, when you would get into the backyard, she had a few outbuildings for storage. There was like a huge chicken coop that was fenced in, and then there was the yard itself, and there may be tables and chairs out there, to sit out in the garden, because at that time a lot of people had goldfish ponds in their yards. We even had one in our yard. Didn't have any goldfish. It was full of dirt, but most of the homes built around that time, they had goldfish ponds or some form of outdoor tranquility. And there was a lot of homes that had that in the elbow. They had a place to go and relax, and it was outside. And like I say, many of them had those goldfish ponds.
That's pretty cool. I never
Yeah.
knew that.
And they were well constructed. They would be dug out and they would be lined with concrete with a rim around them, and there were a lot of them down there. That's one of the things that I really noticed about Mrs. Thomas's yard. It was huge, and it had all the amenities for you to just relax and never have to go anywhere. They had everything you needed.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
That is awesome. Does anybody else have any questions?
Oh, then-
About 49 minutes in. My dad's a storyteller, if you
Well,
couldn't tell.
yeah.
He answers a lot of questions
Well, that's some-
through the stories.
Well, there were some good people in the elbow. I talked about Mr. Light. Mr. Light had a sister that lived in the elbow, and she lived right at the south end of Noble Park. Mrs. Warren was her name. Mrs. Warren, as you would pass her house, she didn't care who you was, whose kid you were. She'd sit on the porch in her swing and she'd wave you over, and then she'd come outside with this big basket full of candy and goodies. And that was her job, was making sure kids had plenty of energy. She would pass out candy on a daily basis, and we knew it so well that we would knock on her door and ask for candy, and she'd always have some available.
I know that's right.
She was the candy lady. Then there was this lady didn't live in the elbow, but I know her from Mount Zion, from my church. Her name was Mrs. Moreland, and she was my Sunday school teacher when I was in the. Now you got what you call. They called us cherubs, intermediates, juniors, and senior class in a church. Now she was my intermediate class Sunday school teacher, Mrs. Moreland. Mrs. Moreland lived right outside the elbow, so she'd usually enter the elbow on 9th Street Bridge, and her Studebaker is what she drove. And she'd come over there, and let's say it's Saturday morning, she would load that Studebaker up with all the kids in the elbow she could find. And then she'd drive us back across the bridge to her home on the west side of town, get us situated, come in the house with us, get us seated, and get us started off with some kind of game to play. And in the meantime, she'd get back on her Studebaker, come back into the elbow, get another carload of kids. Sometimes I can remember as many as 25, maybe 30 kids at her home, and she would go and get them a few at a time. I'm sure Teresa and James Jones remember, because Teresa was there. She was a little girl, and she went with us. Of course, she didn't live in the elbow, so that tells you that Mrs. Moreland not only went to the elbow, but outside the elbow and collected kids. And she would collect us, bring us to her home. And it would start off, we'd say a prayer, we'd say pledge allegiance to the flag. She'd give us games to play, teach us how to play games, feed us cake, ice cream, candy, all the fun that we could have. And that her deal was to keep us out of trouble, keep us out of bad places. And I have nothing but fond memories of Mrs. Moreland, because she worked tirelessly with kids, either in the church and when church wasn't going on, outside of church. But the elbow and the Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church, sometimes me and my contemporaries, we don't have a life. We're in church every day. You know, you had like Wednesdays was a regular church night for everybody. Everybody had to go on Wednesdays. Of course, Sundays everybody had to go. But through the weeks, you had things like the Young Ambassadors, which Mr. White, his name was Roland White. He'd come around and collect all the young men, and all of these things were Bible based. So like on Tuesday night, you might be at the Royal Ambassadors. Wednesday night, you're on church service. Thursday night, you might have choir rehearsal. So you had something to do all the time. They made sure that we were busy. But
so what's missing in the world today?
yeah, but those people took time with the kids. They took time with the elderly. And like I say, it's just a great sense of community. And we had a family that lived down the street from us on the opposite corner. And they had a granddaughter. Their last name was Mr. and Mrs. Corn. And I remember them well because they were some of the brightest people that lived in the Elbow. Now, they were African American, but they were really, really bright skinned. And each year, their granddaughter would come visit in the Elbow. Her name was BB. And there was nobody at BB's age except for me and my cousin Welton. So whenever BB would come down, my aunt would make sure that we went down and played with BB and spent time with her, because she had no friends here. She was an outsider, so to speak. So we'd go down and we'd knock on the door of Mr. and Mrs. Corn, and I can remember some of the first times that we had to go there. I can still remember it like yesterday. We're two guys. What do we do? What do we do with her? We don't even like girls, you know. And she made us go down there and spend time with BB.
Absolutely.
And that was every year. And we knew about what time, well, she's coming. So what we had to do, sometimes we'd sit on the porch. She had a screened-in porch. We just sit on the porch and swing in the swing and look at each other. What do you say? We don't know. We're two young guys. We didn't have a clue what to say. And so, and Sandra, you know, Sandra was older than BB. So, you know, Sandra had her own friends. But we were her age, and we had to go down and play with BB.
Wow.
And you know, it wasn't as much fun as playing with Patsy Ruth. Now, Patsy Ruth, boy, she could run, she could do everything that we did, and she was just as much as a kid as we were. But BB was a whole different deal, man. It was odd. So all we did was, well, what do you like to do? I like to fish. You fish? Never been fishing. You know, BB came from a big city. So she'd never been fishing, and of course, Mr. and Mrs. Corn wouldn't let her off the front porch. So it wasn't like we could do a whole lot, you know. So we just went and kept her company.
What can you do?
Yeah, and that's probably one of the places I learned to play jacks well, because that was considered a girly game. So we had to play jacks with BB or something like that. Pick up sticks and jacks. That was our entertainment. Yeah. Yeah, but you know, it was what it was. Yeah,
Oh, goodness.
that was.
The elbow.
Yeah, but like I say, if you came to the Elbow, you were made to feel welcome. And I was talking about Leander earlier. He had an aunt, and this is name Romaine Glover.
Yes.
When you would go to Romaine's house. I think I went to her front door maybe once in my entire life living in the Elbow, because when you went to Romaine's house, you always went through the gate, around the house, to the back door. And on the back door, that was her back porch, and it was, I'd say it was roughly about 15 feet long and about maybe 10 feet wide. And all on that back porch, she had one of those big turkey roasting deals that sat on the cabinet. But when you would walk in, her husband had built her shelving all the way around. And there was some seating in there, because on the back porch, she would have a feast every day. When you would come in, there would be a stack of platters and a stack of plates. And she'd say, no, get you one of them plates, boy, get you some food. And I can recall going over on many occasions that I'd get a plate and then they'd put it back and they'd give me a platter. And I'd go around, there'd be collard greens, cornbread, fried chicken, baked ham, mashed potatoes, sliced bread, homemade rolls. She fixed all that stuff herself. Macaroni and cheese, you name it. She had smorgasbord on the back porch. And she fed nieces, nephews, her own family, the family from across the street. The Turners might come across because they were right across the street from the Turners. They might come across and get a plate. But if I was over and it was time to eat at Leander's house, they wasn't cooking because they go over to Romaine's house, and she always cooked every day. I don't know where she found the time because she worked at the hospital. But there was always food like that every single day. Every day.
Wow.
Yeah, and she fed a lot of people. That's one of the things people in the elbow did. They would feed you. And there's several Saturday mornings that I can remember. Me and my cousin, we'd get up to go watch TV. Folks, they didn't watch TV very much on the weekends. So we'd be up early in the morning to turn the TV on and watch cartoons. And one morning we turned it on, and then we happened to see this figure pass the window. He was out in our yard, in our front yard. And he just stopped there and he stood. And so Welton and I went and told my aunt. We said, there's a guy standing out in the yard. And she said, you boys go in there and open that trunk up and tear me a piece of that white linen off, about that big. So we ran in there in her bedroom. She kept a big black trunk against the wall under the window. So we opened it up and went through there. Sure enough, there's a big old piece of sheet, and it had been tore off several times. So we opened it up, tore off a section like she said, and brought it back. She was in the kitchen. She went to the refrigerator. She put some items in there. She went to the pantry. She put some items in there. She went to her bedroom. I don't know what she got out of there, but she put it all in there, and she bundled it all up and tied it off. And then she walked out the door. And that gentleman stood out there, and then she took it out there and she gave it to him. And we were listening, and she said, now here you go. She said, God bless you. And he said, thank you, ma'am. God bless you. And he turned and he walked away. I'd seen that maybe 3 times when I lived in the elbow with them. And what he did was he was hobo. And he came off those tracks right there as you come into the elbow. And Ralph and I talked about this several times. And we didn't know that they had a hobo code. But they had somewhere, they know exactly which house to come to. And of course, your address is right up over the door there. And they would come to 920 East Grant. But that was a deal that was from the hobo camps, and that's how come they knew where to come, even though they'd never been to this town. We finally got wind of how they, know where to go, where to get food, where to get help. And what I did find out, one of the things that she would put in when she go to her bedroom was needle and thread. She would give them needle and thread. She would give them food. If she had an article of clothing, she'd give them that. And then she was in there tearing off an extra piece of linen. She said they might need it for a bandage or whatever, but she kind of knew the things that they needed. And as Ralph and I were talking about it, he said, you remember those letters from Uncle Douglas? I said, yeah. How was he our uncle? He said, I don't know if he was our uncle or if he wasn't our uncle, but Uncle Douglas would write us a letter from every town that he went to. You remember that? I said, yeah, because Uncle Douglas was a hobo. Yeah, and that's the only name that I know him by. I don't know if we're related, if he's really an uncle or not, but he would write a letter, and each time a letter came to the house, she would make it a point to get us kids and everybody together. We'd go in the living room, she'd read that letter, so everybody heard it at the same time. And that was our way to keep tabs on where Uncle Douglas was, what town he was in. And he may be over in Phoenix, Arizona, He might have been in Colorado, but that's how he traveled, was on the train.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow. That's crazy.
yeah, he was a hobo.
Whew.
Yeah, but that's the spirit and the nature of people in the airboat. They some giving, caring people, and they look out. And I guess that's probably why some of my coworkers say, "Well, you act like a socialist." Well, I guess I am somewhat a socialist because I believe it's important to help other people.
Mm-hmm.
I've always believed that because that's the way I was raised,
Absolutely.
to help other folks. And if I got something I can share with you, I don't have a problem sharing it. You know, if I got an abundance of something, then you got some too.